Sarah Bennett hadn't planned on making history that Tuesday morning. The spring sun filtered through the tall windows of Boston's municipal court as she sat quietly on the wooden bench, waiting for her case to be called. She had come here directly from teaching her morning seminar at Harvard Law, still in the casual navy blazer and comfortable flats far from the usually expensively dressed figure in courtrooms. The courthouse bustled with its usual morning activity. Court officers directing people through security. Lawyers rushed past briefcases. The hum of constant murmurs off marble walls as case after case was called, each one wrote routine to the keenly observant Sarah. At 43, Sarah had spent her entire career studying and teaching about the justice system. Her office walls at Harvard were covered with awards and certificates, including her doctorate in constitutional law and a slew of published papers on civil rights. But today, she was just another person waiting to come test a parking ticket. The cat-eye had come 3 weeks ago, outside the Roxbury Community Center. Sarah had been running a free legal clinic there, helping low-income residents understand their rights, when one of her elderly clients had fallen ill. Sarah had parked in a no-parking zone to help the woman reach her son's car. By the time she returned, the parking enforcement officer was already writing the ticket. Sarah checked her watch. 10:45 a.m. Her next class wasn't until 2 p.m. But she was hoping this wouldn't take too long. Around her, other people fidgeted on the benches. A young mother trying to quiet a baby. An older man in a worn suit kept checking his paperwork over and over, his hand shaking. Sarah gave him an encouraging smile. Suddenly, the bay's voice cut into the murmur. Docket number 247, Sarah Bennett. Sarah collected her simple black handbag and the folder with her documentation and moved to the front of the courtroom. She couldn't help but notice she was one of only 3 black people in the room. After 20 years in academia, she was used to being the only person of color in many spaces, but it never stopped being noticeable. Judge Richard Maxwell barely looked up as she approached the podium. He was a man in his early 60s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, known throughout the Boston legal community for his strict interpretation of the law. Sarah had actually quoted one of his decisions in a recent paper, though she wondered after he recognized her name. Mississippi Bennett, he said, still looking down at his papers. You're contesting a parking violation from March 15. Sarah noted the miss immediately, not Ms. or ma'am, and certainly not doctor, but she had learned long ago to keep her voice steady and professional regardless of any given circumstance. Yes, Your Honor, she responded clearly. I can explain the situation that led to the temporary parking violation. The judge finally looked up. His expression already showed signs of impatience. Sarah stood straight, her posture perfect after all these years of commanding lecture halls. She was about to say something, when Judge Maxwell cut her off. The citation clearly states, you were parked in a no parking zone for. He checked the paper. 23 minutes. Do you deny this? No, Your Honor, but there were extenuating circumstances. I was conducting a legal clinic at the community center when one of my elderly clients, Miss Bennett. The judge cut in once more, his voice firmer and more patronizing. The sign clearly stated, no parking at any time. The law doesn't make allowances for being late for appointments. Sarah's jaw clenched minutely, but her voice came out steady. Your Honor, if you will permit me to explain, this wasn't a matter of being late. There was a medical situation with the fine is $120. Judge Maxwell announced, already going for his gavel. Next time I suggest you plan your schedule better and respect the parking laws. Like everybody else. The young mother from earlier let out a soft oh. The older man with the shaking hands just looked down at his feet, but Sarah didn't budge. Instead, she reached into her bag, not for her wallet, but for her faculty ID and bar credentials. 20 years of teaching she had taught herself that timing was everything. Sometimes, most often, the most powerful lesson came from letting people realize their mistakes themselves. Standing there, holding her Harvard Law School faculty card, she watched as, For one frozen moment, Judge Maxwell's eyes caught the embossed crimson shield and the letters P. The courtroom had gone very, very quiet. The heaviness of the silence was thick in the courtroom as Judge Maxwell stared on at the Harvard faculty ID in Sarah's hand. His face, which had been set in stern lines just moments before, now showed the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering with uncertainty, as everyone waited to see what was going to happen next. "I apologize," Dr. Bennett said, Judge Maxwell with deliberation, using the proper title this time. "I did not know that I may be qualified to understand the law." Sarah's voice was low, but loud enough to carry to the back of the courtroom. "Or that someone who looks like me might be a Harvard professor." The young mother, who had watched earlier, shifted forward in her seat. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The bailiff, who had seen a horrid lot of cases come and go, was paying closer attention now. Judge Maxwell's face reddened slightly. "Dr. Bennett, I assure you that your background has nothing to do with my background." Sarah placed both hands on the podium, her posture straight, professional. "Your Honor, let me tell you about my background. I've been teaching constitutional law at Harvard for 12 years. Before that, I clerked for the Supreme Court. The legal clinic she was running that day helps people who cannot afford lawyers understand their basic rights." She paused, letting her words sink in. The old man with the quivering papers was, at that moment, looking at her with something akin to pride in his eyes. The two lawyers waiting for their cases ceased checking their mobile phones, and were now paying close attention. "But most importantly," Sarah added, "I'd like to explain why I was parked in that no parking zone if you will allow me to finish this time." Judge Maxwell nodded slowly, his earlier impatience now replaced with due attention. "Please, continue, Dr. Bennett." Mrs. Rodriguez was a 78-year-old grandmother who had just finished receiving aid with her tenant rights paperwork when she began experiencing chest pains. Her son was already outside, but she couldn't walk the 2 blocks to where he was parked. "So yes, I parked in a no parking zone for 23 minutes while helping a possible heart attack victim reach her son's car." The courtroom remained silent, but now it was a different kind of silence, one filled with understanding rather than tension. Sarah opened her FR and pulled out a piece of paper. "I have here a note from the emergency room doctor who treated Mrs. Rodriguez. That day, she did in fact have a minor heart attack. The doctor stated that getting her prompt medical attention was crucial." Judge Maxwell took the paper, reading it carefully. His hands trembled slightly as he set it down. The same man, who had been so quick to dismiss her earlier, now looked deeply uncomfortable. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "finally, why didn't you mention this medical emergency at the start?" Sarah's reply was measured but firm. "I tried, Your Honor, 3 times, but you seemed more interested in making assumptions about me rather than to the facts of the case." A number of people in the courtroom nodded quietly. A lowly young clerk in the back scribbled something in his notebook. Judge Maxwell took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Suddenly, he appeared tired. "Dr. Bennett, I owe you an apology," he said, and his voice was different now, less commanding, more human. "I was unfair to make the assumptions that I did and didn't extend you the basic courtesy of presenting your case. The ticket is dismissed, of course." But Sarah didn't rise to her feet to leave. Instead, she pulled another paper from her folder. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I'd like to present something else for the court's consideration." Judge Maxwell put his glasses back on, looking curious despite himself. "Yes, this is data from a study I recently completed on racial and gender bias in traffic court proceedings. Would you be interested in hearing some of the findings?" The judge looked at her for a long moment. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, Dr. Bennett," he said quietly, "I believe I would." Sarah glanced around the courtroom, every face turned to her now, waiting. She had taught thousands over the years, but something told her this might be one of her most important lessons yet. She straightened her papers and began to speak. Sarah took a deep breath now and began to present her research findings. to the now captivated courtroom. The voice, honed from years of lecturing at Harvard, rang clearly out through space as she shared the shocking statistics. Over the last 5 years, Your Honor, Black and Hispanic defendants in traffic court were 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines compared to white defendants. For the same violations, women of color in particular were interrupted an average of 4 times more often. During their testimony, Judge Maxwell's face grew more serious with each number she presented the court. Reporters' fingers flew across her keyboard, recording every word. 2 more lawyers had slipped into the back of the courtroom, attracted by the unusual scene unfolding. In cases where defendants were addressed by Hannock, Sarah continued, white men were called sir or Mr. 98% of the time. For black women with advanced degrees, correct titles were used only 27% of the time, even when their credentials were clearly aided in court documents. She paused, letting the number sink in. A law student in the gallery was frantically taking notes. The young mother, who had been watching earlier, wiped away tears from her eyes, nodding in recognition of experiences she likely herself had. These aren't just numbers, Your Honor, Sarah said softly. These are real people, real experiences, real justice being delayed or denied because of unconscious bias, the same bias that led you to dismiss my explanation before even hearing it. Judge Maxwell removed his glasses again, but this time it wasn't from tiredness. His hands weren't quite steady as he placed them on the bench. Dr. Bennett, he said, his voice rough with emotion, how long have you been collecting this data? 3 years, Sarah replied. My team has observed over 2,000 traffic court sessions across 12 different jurisdictions. We documented patterns that reflect a larger systemic issue in our justice system. The older man, who had been clutching his papers a moment before, raised his hand hesitantly. Judge Maxwell, very uncharacteristically, not following the rules of court, nodded for him to speak. I have been here 6 times, the man said, in a shaky yet strong voice, and each time they have spoken down to me because of my age and my color. Never let me tell them my story, just the way they did to you, Dr. Bennett. She turned and faced him, nodding respectfully to him. Sir, would you be willing to share your experience as part of our ongoing research? The man sat up straighter, pride replacing his earlier nervousness. Yes, ma'am, I surely would. Judge Maxwell cleared his throat. Dr. Bennett, I believe your research deserves a wider audience. Would you be willing to present these findings at our next judicial training session? Sarah looked around the courtroom. The young mother was now sitting forward, hope clear in her eyes. The law student had stopped taking notes and was watching intently. Even the babe, with seen thousands of cases come and go, seen moved by what was happening. Your Honor, Sarah replied, I would be happy to, but more than that, I'd like to propose something else. What if we use this courtroom, your courtroom, as a pilot program for change? The judge leaned forward, interested. What kind of change? Simple changes at first, letting people finish their explanations, using proper titles consistently for everyone, recording demographic data on fine amounts, and interruptions. Small steps that could make a big difference. Judge Maxwell was silent for a very long moment. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its exhaled breath until finally he spoke. Dr. Bennett, for 15 years, I've been sitting upon this bench and always prided myself on being just and unbiased. However, today you have brought it to my attention that perhaps I haven't been quite fair as I thought, so I accept your proposal. There was a murmuration of approval in the courtroom. The court reporter smiled as she typed. The law student in the back had tears in his eyes. Thank you, Your Honor, Sarah said. When would you like to begin? Judge Maxwell looked at his watch, then at the full courtroom, and made a decision. Right now, Dr. Bennett, right now. Sarah nodded. She knew full well the gravitas of the moment. What started out as a routine parking ticket was about to become something much more significant. She opened her folder once more, ready to help facilitate actual change in this small corner of the justice system. The next several hours in Judge Maxwell's courtroom would be something that no one present would ever forget. Instead of calling the next case, the judge did something no one had ever seen before. He converted his traffic court into an impromptu forum for justice reform. If you are comfortable sharing, Judge Maxwell led the waiting room in this tolerant tone. I'd like to hear from others who feel they've been treated unfairly in this court system. First, there was no response. They looked around at each other, questionably, wondering if this was for real. Sarah stood silently beside the podium, and as if her presence somehow emboldened others, then one by one, hands started to raise. The young mother, who had been observing all of this from her seat, got to her feet first, clutching her baby close. "My name is Maria Trace," she said, her voice firming as she spoke. "Last month, I was fined $200 for being 5 minutes late to court. My babysitter canceled, and I had to bring my son. Nobody asked why I was late. Nobody cared that I had to take 2 buses to get here." Judge Maxwell nodded, gesturing to his clerk. "Please make a note to review Mrs. Torres' case." He turned back to Maria. "I apologize not taking your circumstances into consideration. Please continue." More stories followed. An elderly Asian woman spoke about being mocked for her accent. A young black man described being treated as suspicious despite wearing his hospital scrubs. A Hispanic teenager, for example, described how, after working the night shift, no one took his word for it that he was a college student when he tried to explain a parking violation near the university library. Sarah's research skills kicked in as each person testified. Pressing her tissues to her eyes, with a honk into her handkerchief every now and then, the court reporter had never typed out so many personal stories in traffic court in all her years. The judge listened to every tale with spreading understanding. His face had begun the day stern and remote. Now it reflected profound concern and genuine interest in each person's expert experience. "Dr. Bennett," he said during a brief pause, "I see now that what happened with you today wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern I've been blind to for years." Sarah nodded. "Recognition is the first step toward change, Your Honor. Would you like to hear my suggestions for immediate improvements?" The judge gestured for her to proceed. The law student, who had been taking notes earlier, pulled out a fresh page ready to capture every word. First, Sarah began implementing a mandatory 5 minutes of listening for each case. No interruptions. No assumptions, just let people tell their stories. She walked closer to the bench, her confidence with each step increasing. Second, make all court staff use appropriate titles and honorifics for all parties, regardless of appearance and origin. Third, start compiling data on fine amounts, demographics, and outcomes regarding treatment in the court system. Let that data be transparent and publicly available. Until this point, Baith had been standing well back. He suddenly spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may," he finished with a nod from the judge. "I could help track the data. I see everything that happens in this courtroom anyway." For the first time that day, Judge Maxwell smiled. "Thank you, Officer Johnson. That would be very helpful." Sarah pulled out one more paper from her folder. "I have a draft proposal for these changes, Your Honor. I wrote it as part of my research, hoping someday to find a judge willing to implement it." The judge looked at the document, then at his filled courtroom. People who had come expecting quick, impersonal hearings were now part of something historic, the beginning of real reform to their local justice system. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "would you be willing to work with this court to bring about these changes, possibly act as an advisor as we overhaul our practices?" Sarah thought about her busy schedule at Harvard, her research, her classes. Then she glanced over at Maria Torres, still clutching her baby, hope rising in her eyes. She saw the older gentleman, who was cowering earlier, now sitting tall and proud. She remembered all the time she taught her students about being agents of change in the legal system. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied firmly. "I would be glad to assist." There was a burst of spontaneous applause across the room. Judge Maxwell had to tap his gavel gently to restore order, but he was smiling as he did so. What had started as a simple parking ticket hearing was turning into what none of them could have foreseen: an actual chance at change in the justice system, beginning right here in this Boston traffic court. By the following week, Word had spread like wildfire through Boston's legal community about what was taking place in Judge Maxwell's courtroom. When Sarah came for the first official meeting of the Reform Committee, she found the courtroom packed with observers interested in what would occur. Lawyers from firms sat shoulder to shoulder with community activists. 3 other judges were there, too, from different courts to learn. Maria Tess was present, too, now working as a part-time translator for the court. Her baby lay sound asleep in a carrier beside her. Dr. Bennett, Judge Maxwell greeted her warmly, so different from their first encounter. "Before we begin, I have something to show you." He handed her a stack of papers, statistics from the past week, since their new policies have been implemented. The numbers were already showing change. Average hearing times had increased by only 3 minutes, but citizen satisfaction scores had doubled. The simple act of letting people tell their stories had transformed the atmosphere of the court. Sarah reviewed the data, noting how Officer Johnson had carefully tracked every interaction. "This is impressive," she said, "but we're just getting started." She pulled out her laptop and hooked it up with a projector in the room. On the screen appeared a presentation entitled "Building a Fair Justice System: The Boston Traffic Court Initiative." First, Sarah began her teaching experience in her clear, confident voice. "I'd like to share what we've learned from just 1 week of changes." The room fell silent as she showed them photographs of a young man in work clothes being addressed as "sir" by court staff, an elderly woman taking her full 5 minutes to explain her situation in her native language with Maria translating. Carefully, Judge Maxwell listened to each case, his face showing genuine interest in these small changes Sarah explained have already affected how people view our justice system. "Last week, a woman told me she left traffic court feeling heard for the first time in her life." The elderly man from the first day, now known to everyone as Mr. Washington, raised his hand. He proudly said that he had been informing his neighbors of the changes. Many of them had lost all hope of ever receiving justice from the courts. Now, they're willing to try again. Judge Maxwell stood up, moving to stand beside Sarah. "What Dr. Bennett and all of you have helped us create here is more than just procedural changes. We're rebuilding trust between the court and the community." A reporter from the Boston Globe, "We've been quietly taking notes," in the corner raised her hand. "Judge Maxwell, would you say this experience has changed how you view your role as a judge?" The judge looked at Sarah for a moment, then back at the reporter. "Absolutely. Dr. Bennett showed me that true justice isn't just about applying the law, it's about seeing and hearing the people in front of us, really hearing them." Sarah watched as other judges in the room nodded in agreement. One of them, Judge Roberts from the district court, spoke up. "I'd like to implement these changes in my courtroom, too. Could you help us set that up?" Dr. Bennett, before Sarah could answer, more requests started coming in. The city council wanted her to present her findings. The police department asked about training sessions. A state senator in the back of the room was already discussing possible legislation. Maria T. stood up, softly swaying her baby. "Dr. Bennett, would you be willing to do a workshop in Spanish? Many in my community want to better understand their rights." Sarah looked around the room at all these people eager for change. She recalled Ming in traffic court, how close everything had come to just being another case of bias and dismissal. Instead, it had become a catalyst for transformation. "Yes," she said firmly, "to all of it, but on one condition." Everyone leaned forward to hear her condition. Sarah beamed, opening her arms towards the entire room. "This cannot be about me or Judge Maxwell or any one person. This has to be about building a system that works for everyone. We need to hear all voices, especially those that have been silenced far too long." The room erupted in applause. Judge Maxwell glowed with pride. Mr. Washington wiped away tears. Maria hugged her baby close, and Sarah looked to their faces, knowing this was only the beginning. What had begun as a simple traffic court confrontation was growing into something much bigger, a real movement for change in the justice system, starting right here in Boston. 3 months after the fateful day in traffic court, Sarah sat in her Harvard office reviewing the latest data from what the media had dubbed the Boston Justice Initiative. The changes had spread far beyond that first courtroom, creating ripples throughout the entire legal system. On her desk lay the morning's Boss Globe, featuring a front-page story about their progress. The headline read, "From Traffic Court to Social Justice: How One Professor Stood Changed Boston's Legal System." Next to it, a photo of Sarah and Judge Maxwell addressing the packed auditorium at the steakhouse. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria Torres. "Dr. Bennett, just finished our 100 Spanish language rights workshop. The community center is about bursting with all the people wanting to learn." She smiled, remembering how Maria grew from a nervous young mother in traffic court to a confident community leader. Now she ran daily workshops helping people understand their legal rights, with her little boy often playing quietly in the corner as she taught. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Washington, neat in his suit, was holding a folder. At 72, he had become one of their most effective advocates, speaking at community meetings and sharing his experiences with young law students. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his eyes twinkling, "you won't believe what happened in Judge Roberts' court this morning." She gestured for him to take a seat. Mr. Washington had been their official court observer for the past month, chronicling how various judges had put their new policy into practice. A young white judge had stopped proceedings to reprimand a lawyer who continually interrupted his black client. Mr. Washington said proudly that he had learned from our training sessions to listen to every voice. That never would have happened 3 months ago. Sarah nodded to add that to her growing collection of positive changes. Her computer pinged with an email Judge Maxwell wanted to meet. The message was marked urgent. 20 minutes later, Sarah walked into the judge's chambers. Now familiar territory after months of collaboration, but something was different today. Judge Maxwell wasn't alone. Standing next to him was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Dr. Bennett identified him. "I have been following your work with great interest," the Chief Justice said warmly. "What you and Judge Maxwell have started here in Boston. Well, we think it's time to take it statewide." Sarah sat down gingerly, her heart bracing. This was bigger than anything they'd imagined. "We wish to put into operation throughout the whole state of Massachusetts your reforms. Courts," the Chief Justice continued, "not just traffic court, every level of the justice system, and we want you to lead the training program." Judge Maxwell stepped forward, his face showing the same excitement she'd seen that first day when they decided to make changes. "Sarah, we've already got requests from other states too: New York, California, Illinois. They all want to know how we did this." Sarah thought about her classes at Harvard, or research, or packed schedule. As if reading her mind, the Chief Justice spoke again. "We talked to Harvard. They're offering you a unique role, in which you will teach one class on applied justice reform while heading up this initiative. Of course, full support, full funding." Before Sarah had time to answer, her phone buzzed again. This was a photo from Maria. Participants from today's workshop, dozens of them, holding up their certificates of completion, their faces aglow with pride and newfound confidence. "More," Judge Maxwell whispered. "Now remember those statistical reports you brought in for me that first day. No bias in the courts. The Department of Justice wants to use them as a template for national reform." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out over Boston. Somewhere out there, other people were facing the same biases she'd encountered that day in traffic court. But now there was a chance to change that, not just in Boston, but across the country. She turned back to face them. "When do we start?" The Chief Justice smiled. "How about right now?" As they began discussing details, Sarah's phone lit up with another message. This one was from a young black law student who had witnessed that first day in traffic court. "Dr. Bennett, I decided to become a judge because of what I saw you do. Thanks for showing me it is possible to change the system from within." Sarah read the message twice, then looked up at the two judges waiting for her response. 3 months ago, she walked into a traffic court expecting a routine hearing. Instead, she started a revolution in justice, one that was only beginning to grow. It had been 1 year since that fateful day in traffic court. Saw stood at the podium in the Grand Hall of the Massachusetts State House, looking out at a sea of faces. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, community leaders, and citizens from across the country, all gathered for the first national conference on judicial reform. Behind her on stage st an impressive group: Judge Maxwell, now head of the State Judicial Training Program; Maria Torres, recently appointed as the Director of Community Outreach for the courts; Mr. Washington, whose document observations have become a published training manual; and representatives from 30 different states interested in implementing what have become known as the Bennett Method. A year ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. I walked into a traffic court expecting to pay a fine. Instead, I found a calling that would change not just my life, but the lives of thousands of others. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing a graph of the year's results. The numbers were striking: civilian complaint compels against courts down by 60%, successful case resolutions up by 45%, and community trust in the judicial system increased by 70%. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sarah said. Let me show you what change looks like. The screen behind her flickered to show a montage of photos. A Spanish-speaking grandmother confidently arguing her case through a court translator. A young black man being referred to as doctor by the court staff. Judge Maxwell lecturing other judges on active listening and bias recognition. Seated in the front row, Mariah's toddler son waved at Sarah. Had become the unofficial mascot of their movement, growing up in courthouses and community centers, where his mother was a voice giver, one who enabled people to find their voices. The changes that we have instituted aren't rocket science, Sarah said. 5 minutes of unimpeded speaking time, proper use of titles and honorifics, regular bias training for all court staff. Simple things that restore dignity to every human being that walks into a courtroom. She pauses as images continue to scroll behind her. Mr. Washington training new court observers. Maria leading workshops. Judges sitting in community centers learning from local residents. But our biggest success isn't in these photographs, Sarah said, her voice growing passionate. It's in the stories we hear every day. The mother who finally felt safe bringing her children to court. The elderly immigrant who said he was treated like a human being for the first time in his legal journey. The young lawyer who told me she finally feels proud to be part of the system. Judge Maxwell rose just then, joining Sarah at the podium. Dr. Bennett's work has fundamentally changed how we view justice, he said. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was part of the problem, but thanks to her, I learned to be part of the solution. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, seated in the front row, nodded in agreement. Next week, she would be announcing a nationwide initiative based on Sarah's program. Sarah looked down at her notes, then set them aside. A year ago, I could have just paid that parking ticket. I could have stayed quiet, accepted the disrespect, gone back to my comfortable office at Harvard. But that would have meant accepting a broken system. The room was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. Instead, we chose to speak up, to challenge, to change. And look what happened. Not because of me, but because every person in this room who decided that justice should mean justice for all. She nodded toward Maria, who stood up, holding a thick binder. Today, we're releasing our entire training program, every form, every procedure, every lesson we've learned, free to any court system that wants to make these changes. The audience erupted into applause, but Sarah raised her hand. But remember, these are only tools. The real transformation comes when we choose to treat every person who walks into our courts as if she were a human entitled to respect and dignity, As she finished speaking, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Mr. Washington wiped tears from his eyes. Judge Maxwell beamed with pride. Maria hugged her son close. From the back of the room, a young court clerk raised her hand. Dr. Bennett, what's next? Where do we go from here? Sarah smiled, looking out at the crowd of people ready to continue this journey of change. Next, she said, next we make sure that what happened and that the traffic court, per se, would never again happen to anyone, anywhere in our justice system. The applause that followed wasn't just for her words. It was for a vision of justice finally translating to reality. 5 years had passed since that memorable day in Boston's traffic court. Sarah Bennett stood in front of the United States Supreme Court building, taking a moment to absorb the magnitude of what was about to happen today. They would present the National Judicial Reform Act, inspired by what had started in that small courtroom behind her. Her gathered a formidable phalanx of supporters. Judge Maxwell, his hair now entirely white, stood tall in his robes. Maria Tez, newly elected state representative, grasped a thick folder filled with testimonials from thousands of constituents. Mr. Washington, well advanced in years, had insisted on attending this historic moment. Dr. Bennett, a voice she knew, called. Sarah turned to find the young law student witness to that maiden stay in traffic court. Only today, she wasn't a student. She was Judge Melissa Chen, the youngest black female judge in Massachusetts history. Can you believe we're really here? Melissa asked, her eyes shining with excitement. Sarah looked at the crowd gathering on the Supreme Court steps. Representatives from all 50 states had come to support the legislation. News cameras lined the street. A group of law students held signs reading "Justice for All." Bennett method worked. The changes they'd started had grown beyond anything they could have imagined over 5 years. Their program had been adopted by more than 200 court systems. Bias complaints in participating courts nationwide had decreased 85%. Community trust in the judiciary was at an all-time high. Mariah's first-grade son tugged on Sarah's sleeve. Dr. Bennett, look, he said, pointing to a school bus pulling up. It was filled with children from nearby schools to witness this historic moment. Just then, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court appeared from the building. She strode right towards Sarah and extended her hand. Dr. Bennett, before we start the formal ceremony, I want you to see something. She led them into an exhibition in the Supreme Court Public Hall, newly installed. There, framed and on the wall, was a photo of that first traffic courtroom in Boston, taken on the day everything changed. Next to it, Sarah's Harvard, Idaho card, the one she showed Judge Maxwell that fateful morning. The words inscribed below them read, "Where justice reformed, the beginning of the Bennett Method 2024." Sarah felt the sting of tears as she read the words. Judge Maxwell laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You changed everything that day," he said softly. "You changed me." Mr. Washington stepped forward, his voice strong despite his years. "You showed us all that one voice speaking up can make a difference. Now look at how many voices are being heard." The main hall was filling up now. Judges from around the country, most of them having transformed their own courtrooms using Sarah's methods. Community leaders who had assisted in spreading the program. Law students who had studied the changes as part of their curriculum. Maria walked up with her tablet showing Sarah, "Look at these latest statistics," she said proudly. Last month, every single state reported improved satisfaction rates in their courts. The Spanish language program alone helped over 100,000 people, Judge Chen added. And most importantly, applications to law school from minority students have doubled. People believe they can be part of the system now. They trust it. The Chief Justice called everyone to attention. In a few minutes, they would present their legislation, a law requiring all U.S. courts to implement dignity, respect, and equal treatment that Sarah had fought for. But before they began, Sarah brought her original team in close. "Remember where this started," she said softly. "One parking ticket. One moment of standing up. One decision to speak instead of staying silent." Judge Maxwell nodded. "And now look where we are." Maria, HUD. Her son. Look where we're going. Mr. Washington smiled. Look who we're bringing with us. As they entered the Supreme Court chamber together, Sarah thought about all the people who would never know the disrespect she'd faced that day in traffic court. Future generations would take it for granted that they would be heard, that they would be treated with dignity, that they would be viewed first as individuals. The Chief Justice called the session to order. Sarah stood ready to present their case for nationwide reform. But first, she looked back at her supporters, judges and citizens, students and seniors, people of every background joining together in this common cause of justice. The point is, this was her real legacy, not just the changing of the system, but the changing of hearts and minds, proving justice could be fair, yet compassionate, letting it be known all voices mattered, the highest court in the land ready to listen, and Sarah Bennett was ready to speak.